Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining Darien Library this Tuesday evening for the tale of Sweeney Todd, Stephen Sondheim's Macabre masterpiece with Gil Harel. Gil is a musicologist and music theorist. We've got a fan in the audience. Currently, he teaches at Naugatuck Valley Community College, where he was presented with the Merit Award for exemplary service to the college. At NVCC, Dr. Harel conducts the college chorale, a cappella ensemble, teaches music history and theory, and serves as musical director of theater productions. He's got his hands full. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. I'm now going to pass the mic over to Gil. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amanda. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining me. And thank you to the Darien Library, as always, for hosting these programs where we get to delve into repertoire spanning from Baroque masterpieces such as Bach's Saint John Passion, which we looked at in March, to, as it happens tonight, we'll be looking at the treasure trove of the Broadway repertoire, and specifically the works of Stephen Sondheim, somebody who we could spend all evening just talking about Sondheim without ever getting to Sweeney Todd specifically. I don't think it's an exaggeration to describe Sondheim as one of the most important figures in the history of Broadway and musical theater. He's been described as the savior of the American musical, the person who reinvented the American musical, somebody who's composed not only plenty of notes, but also lots of lyrics. He's like Stephen Schwartz, who we looked at in our last program when we discussed Pippin. Sondheim is someone who's equally facile, it seems, with lyrics as well as with musical notes. And actually, this is something we're going to get into tonight. We'll look at some of the prose, the poetry that goes into Sweeney Todd. I would suggest early on in our program this evening that much of the success of Sweeney Todd, the musical, hinges on the very compelling arrangement of the text that was configured by Sondheim based on a play by Christopher Bond and with input from a guy named Hugh Wheeler. Some of you may recognize Hugh Wheeler. He was also involved in what I believe to be Leonard Bernstein's greatest comedic piece, which is Candide. That would be a great piece for a future program. But nonetheless, like Candide, Sweeney Todd is a bit of an odd work in that it really straddles the line between musical theater and opera. And if you remember, there are some critical differences between musical theater and opera. In an opera, we're going to have singers performing without microphones, right? Singing with a microphone, as logical as it would seem to many of us here this evening, is very taboo in the operatic world. Some of you probably remember the three tenors, and they would go to big venues like the former Shea Stadium, now Citi Field, where the Mets play, and they would sing. And of course, you have to sing with a microphone when you're in a venue that size and when you're singing into a stadium that is essentially outdoors. But some of the opera purists really frowned upon that because in musical theater, opera is totally different in that way. In musical theater, the singers are mic'd up, and in opera, they are singing purely acoustically. And I think it's fair to say that in opera, the purists would argue that sort of part of the art is the ability to project above the orchestra. This is especially true in the works of, say, Richard Wagner, where the tenors or sometimes the basses and baritones have to project above this, 200-piece late romantic orchestra, and they can really tax their voices in doing so. The term that gets bandied about with Wagner operas is the Helden tenor, the heroic tenor, or if you know Die Götterdämmerung, the Twilight of the Gods, the fourth opera in the Ring franchise, the Ring tetralogy, the Ring cycle as it's known, is something where the character of Hagen has to sing this sort of blaring music above the brass. So you don't have to worry about that in a musical because you're going to be mic'd up. Therefore, the style of singing is different. However, some differences we might find that are more pronounced would be something like in an opera, you're going to have a huge orchestra, right? Especially in a romantic opera, whereas in a musical, you might have a very small pit. A good example would be, for example, Next to Normal, which won a number of accolades and awards in 2009, and it consists of a pit of exactly 6 people. So you can have a bigger ensemble in the orchestra versus in a musical, you could have just a handful of performers. Other difference would include the singing style, which I mentioned, which in musical theater is sometimes described as a belting timbre, that is to say, a sort of a forceful, muscled sound, whereas in opera, there's going to be more vibrato, there's going to be more of a classically trained sound. I can tell you from experience that trained opera singers sometimes put their noses in the air when they're listening to musical theater. In fact, if I could share an anecdote, when I was at Brandeis University completing my doctoral work, it was made clear to us in this case being the graduate students, that musical theater was not a serious pursuit, that this was something that verged on popular music and therefore was not in the lofty realm, that sort of upper echelon of academic music that they wanted us to study. What I later discovered was that this mentality is not exclusive to ivory tower institutions like Brandeis. It tends to be the case in a lot of hoity-toity academic, sort of deeply ensconced traditional conservative faculty members. So it's not a bad thing necessarily. I disagree with it. I think musical theater is just as viable as opera or any other genre for that matter. And I think to say nothing about how enjoyable it is compared to the 12-tone music that they wanted us to look at by composers like Arnold Schoenberg and Pierre Boulez, I think most people would agree that musical theater is far more palatable to the average listener. So these are just some differences. Again, I'm not suggesting that musical theater has to be written in a style that appropriates elements of popular music, and I'm not suggesting that opera has to be written in a style that's lofty and academic. In fact, as we'll see this evening, in the case of Sweeney Todd, this is very much a work that straddles the line between opera and musical theater. So just to give you an example of why that is, the orchestra in Sweeney Todd, even though this is a Broadway show, is something like close to 30 people strong. It's a relatively massive orchestra, pit orchestra by Broadway standards. This compared to shows like Dear Evan Hansen, which I think has 7 or 8, or Next to Normal, which I mentioned, which has 6. This is a substantially larger show. And again, the instruments you're going to have here, string instruments, for example, the complement of the string orchestra, violin, viola, cello, bass, the various wind instruments, including clarinets, oboes, flutes. It's going to be much more evocative of a traditional orchestra than it would be of a musical theater pit in the Broadway scene. Another thing about Sondheim is that this music is incredibly difficult. Sondheim in general is regarded as a composer who wrote difficult music, but I would suggest that Sweeney Todd is an especially fiendishly difficult piece. And we're going to take a look at the score this evening, and I will show you some. Oh, my daughter opened the door. Oh, sweetheart. Okay, I'll see you later. She's opening doors now, by the way. So it's very exciting times here. So we were talking about the size of the orchestra, the difficulty of the music. A lot of the music is so chromatic and angular that it verges on atonality. In other words, if I asked you, what key is this particular number in some cases in Sweeney Todd, it's very hard to tell. And I can tell you that in my advanced music theory classes at the college, we often look at musical theater scores, and that Sondheim in particular is someone whose music would give even the most advanced and the most precocious music theory student would give them quite a bugbear to work out, quite a Gordian knot to untangle when it comes to music theory. So what else can we say about Stephen Sondheim? As I mentioned, he's one of the most important figures in the history of musical theater. Some of you may be familiar with some of his other works, which would include Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, Company, Follies, A Little Night Music, Sunday in the Park with George, Into the Woods. He's also an accomplished lyricist, which I mentioned. He wrote the lyrics to West Side Story, right? We all know West Side Story. I think most of us associate it strictly with Leonard Bernstein, but actually Sondheim was responsible for the text, so had an important hand to play there in one of the most iconic musicals of the entire century. So let's talk now about Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. This is a rather macabre story, is it not? There's something ghoulish and fiendish and grisly and gruesome about this plot. I should point out that it wasn't really conceived that way. Sweeney Todd is based on the penny dreadful literature of the Victorian era. This is one of those moments where if we were in person, I would ask, raise your hand if you've heard of the penny dreadful literature of the Victorian era. So I would imagine many of you have. Actually, Londoners, and I suppose we might say that the British in general, have a kind of a different sense of humor and maybe a more jaded perspective when it comes to the plot that's conveyed here in the musical. And I'll tell you a funny anecdote about that when we get to listening to that. All right. So Sweeney Todd is the story of a barber, but he's not just any barber. He's a vengeful barber. He's a murderous barber. He's not an evil man per se. He's not a sociopath. Well, maybe you could make the case that he is, but he's been driven to an extreme psychological edge by events that have left him disillusioned with life, sort of dead on the inside, and really motivated by only one thing that remains to him in life, which is vengeance. So when the plot opens, it actually starts with a grave being dug. And the grave diggers are sort of, shoveling dirt into the stage, and Sweeney Todd arises. And the first words we hear sung by an ensemble member are, "Attend the tale of Sweeney Todd." And we hear about this barber who, as many of you know, I'm sure, not just from the musical, but probably because you're more familiar with the 2007 slasher musical film directed by, well, who else would do it, right? If it's going to be an amalgam of a slasher film and a Broadway musical, it would have to be Tim Burton, right? And of course, it was Tim Burton, with Johnny Depp playing the eponymous Sweeney Todd and Helena Bonham Carter playing the role of Nellie Lovett. We're going to look at their music when we analyze the score this evening, and we'll see how Sondheim suffuses their notes with very sort of distinct characteristics that are appropriate for those characters. And, it stands to reason that we're talking about this musical for a reason, not just because, I picked it, but I think this is one of the generally recognized iconic musicals in the repertoire. It's won numerous awards, the Olivier Awards, it won at the Tony Awards, including the most coveted, arguably the most coveted award at the Tonys, which is Best Musical. The fact that it was turned into a $100 million Broadway adaptation into a Hollywood film also tells us that this is a special piece. That is to say, the music is very special. And I think you could make the argument that the story itself is a compelling one. It goes back to the Victorian era, so we're talking about 19th century England. We're specifically talking about a period which Christopher Bond, who wrote the play upon which the musical was based or inspired by, described as something that was profoundly shaped and influenced by the Industrial Revolution. And there's a parallel to be drawn here, and it's this, very simple. The parallel is that Sweeney Todd character, Benjamin Barker, that's his real name, his alias is Sweeney Todd, is a product of his environment in the same way that the factory workers of the 19th century in London were products of their own environment and their circumstances, which is to say that Bond believed that the factory, these long hours in this grim, sooty, grimy environment, sort of sapped the vitality and the very soul out of the people who work there. That's sort of I think, a very grim take. But of course, when we read the literature of the Victorian era, I think this is a recurring trope, isn't it? The factory life is a very harsh one, that it inflicts tremendous hardship and privation even on those who are laboring away for these 12-hour shifts or whatever it is, in a city that quickly swelled in population in the 19th century and became overwhelmingly filthy. And, the Thames became overwhelmingly polluted. And this is, before the advent of water closets. So you've got night soil, which I think some of you know what that is. If you don't, you can Google it. I won't I won't say any more about that. But the point is that London is sort of this dirty, grimy, dangerous place. And I think that's a kind of important backdrop to have in mind when we listen to this musical, because we want to ask ourselves, with any musical, with any opera, with any piece, what's the composer setting out to do here? What's the composer setting out to evoke? What kind of mood or atmosphere is the music meant to strike, and is it successful in that? So knowing that the backdrop here is Victorian-era London, in the full throttle surge in population of the city, as the factories sprout up like mushrooms after a hard rain, and people are moving into the city to work in those factories, and it's dirty and it's grimy and it's dangerous, and there's prostitutes and there's gambling and there's all sorts of black market, illegal, illicit contraband being smuggled about, and that's sort of the London that we're presented with here in the musical. So the first thing we hear is we see Sweeney Todd rising from the grave, and the ensemble sings "Attend the Tale of Sweeney Todd," and then they describe him as this sort of murderous barber bent on revenge. Let's listen to the opening number. We're going to look at the score here. Now, an astute music theorist would look and say, well, this looks like it's in F sharp minor, and it is. But what I want you to pay attention to here is how difficult this is to count. Even though it's written in a steady meter, it's very difficult to count. And what we're going to see is that some of the accents, that is to say in the music, some of the metrical emphases do not coincide with where we want them to coincide. There are some great examples of this. For example, what Sondheim has running mostly throughout this is he puts the emphasis. You see these little slashes here? It might be a little hard to see. These slashes here, these tenuto marks, which suggest that these notes have some sort of primacy or emphasis, come in the middle of the measure, which is very unusual. Usually the important note in a measure is the very first one. So it's very quiet, it's sort of played in the strings, very smooth, but with these popping accents that come in unexpected places in the middle of the bar. And I just love, you have to admire Sondheim's facility here with lyrics. Attend the tale of Sweeney Todd. Really, what verb could you use there that's better? Behold the tale of Sweeney Todd? No, listen to the tale of Sweeney Todd. Little details like this testify to Sondheim's gift when it came to, specifically when it came to setting music and marrying the music with the text he had composed. So here is Sweeney Todd, and let's go ahead and listen to the opening. Yes, indeed. So, what did you think of the opening of Sweeney Todd? Well, there are all sorts of oddities here in the score. We talked about some of the rhythm. Did you notice that at the end when they say the demon Barber of Fleet Street, and the word street comes in the middle of the measure in an odd place where we don't anticipate it. Did you notice how high the soprano part goes at one point all the way up to a C sharp in the 6th octave, sort of operatic note that you would almost never see in a traditional Broadway score. But as I said, this particular musical straddles the line between opera and Broadway repertoire. In fact, there's a story about the premiere in 1979 that someone from the Met Opera, a big important figure from the Met Opera, was in attendance. And there was someone who was a sort of a supporter of the Met Opera who went up to him and said, why don't we program this at the opera? And he said, well, we weren't asked to. In other words, that Sondheim could have theoretically shopped this piece to the opera and perhaps have gotten a favorable reaction. It really does have operatic qualities. And the difficulty of the music is apparent here, but it's going to be especially apparent later on in the show, especially in the opening of Act 2, which has got to be one of the most imposing and daunting numbers, big ensemble numbers in any musical. So I see we have a couple of questions here. Karen asks, is this the original cast? Yes, this is the original cast from 1979, featuring the Canadian actor Len Cariou is in the role of Sweeney Todd, and of all people, it's Angela Lansbury in the role of Nellie Lovett. We're going to meet Mrs. Lovett. She makes her appearance in the next scene. So actually, the story goes that Sondheim really wanted a comic character to Nellie Lovett, that the story should be, yes, it is filled with this story of the details regarding the macabre and the gruesome and the grisly, and it's about vengeance, right? That's what it says about Sweeney Todd. He served a dark and a vengeful God. Yes, it is about that, but Sondheim clearly thought that there was a kind of dark, morose humor here. And so when he asked Angela Lansbury, who was then, this had been in the 70s, apparently had become something of a sensation, and she was hesitant and she sort of balked at being offered the role. And Sondheim said, why not? And she said, well, the show is called Sweeney Todd. It's not called Nellie Lovett. And so Sondheim kind of chuckled, and then he played some of the music he had in mind for Mrs. Lovett, and Lansbury sung through it and loved it, and loved, it made a favorable impression on her, let's say that. And so she signed off and joined the cast. And yes, this is a very iconic pairing here with Carey and Lansbury, and this is again in 1979. All right, let's talk about what happens next. Now, we have some other questions. I'm going to get to them. Please, I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A function. I'm happy to read them. All right, so we're talking about Mrs. Lovett. I want to stick with that. Mrs. Lovett is a sort of, well, she's older. It's implied in the story that she's in her 40s or thereabouts, and she can be described as amoral. She could be described as sort of maybe a bit of a slattern. That is to say, she's very familiar with Sweeney Todd, even after first meeting him, when she sort of makes him, that is to say, identifies him correctly as Benjamin Barker. They forge this weird relationship and this weird partnership, which becomes increasingly dark, sinister, but has its comic elements as well. So how does the musical open? Well, we just listened to this sort of breaking of the fourth wall, right? What do I mean by that? Well, think about what Sweeney just said here. He said, what happens next? Well, that's the play, and he wouldn't want us to give it away. In other words, he's referring to the cast, telling you, the audience, what happens, what's the fate of Benjamin Barker or Sweeney Todd. Actually, what we get in the first song is a really charming introduction, which features a lot of brass instruments and wind instruments. It's slow, it's majestic, and the song is called No Place Like London. Now, let me show you the score so we can take a look at what's going on here. A street by the London docks. So a ship has come in, and who comes off the ship? Anthony. His name is Anthony Hope. He's a young sailor, dashing and heroic in a way. Anthony is one of only two characters in the entire musical that I think we could describe as being even halfway decent in moral character. Todd comes in, and it turns out we learned that Sweeney Todd has been serving in an Australian penal colony for 15 years. And we don't know exactly the circumstances regarding his return to London, but we know that he's rescued by Anthony the sailor. And so they've arrived in London, and he's going to bid farewell to Anthony as he's made it back to essentially his old stomping grounds, where he had to leave due to unknown circumstances. We're going to learn about them here. And now he's returned. And we know, of course, from the opening number, why is he returned? It's vengeance, folks. He wants vengeance, but we don't know yet for what. Of all the people who's going to narrate that particular detail, it's going to be Mrs. Lovett. So we have, again, these big, majestic chords played, especially in the brass. And we get this music that's open and breezy, and it makes it feel like we're outdoors. We've just come off the docks. And then we're going to meet Mrs. Lovett, and she's going to sing a song called The Worst Pies in London. So Fleet Street is where it takes place. Of course, Fleet Street is, I think, a famous and iconic street in London. Those of you who have spent time in London will no doubt testify to that. That's where the action takes place, and that's where Mrs. Lovett's baking shop is located. And what does she bake? Well, she bakes pies. What sort of pies, might you ask? Well, probably that's a question you don't want to ask because we know where, for those of you who don't know where this is going, I use the word grisly, I use the word macabre, I use the word gruesome. You can probably guess where this is going. We've got a guy who's hell-bent on vengeance, and he happens to be a barber, which is convenient, which means he can lure people to his barber shop, and maybe, oops, there goes the razor, as they sang in the opening number, swing your razor high, Sweeney, raise it to the skies. All right, let's listen to No Place Like London, and this is featuring Todd, Anthony, remember he's that heroic sailor, and then this mysterious beggar woman. Who is she? Just an extra? Is that her name, beggar woman? Well, that's how she's referred to in the score. And in fact, when we first encounter her, she's presented to us in a way that makes it clear she's really a pathetic specimen. She's a tragic, sad case. In fact, she sort of makes sexual advances towards Anthony and Todd, which suggests that she's prostituting herself to some degree, but it also becomes clear, not only from her words, but especially from her music, that she's insane. She's insane, and you might ask, well, what does that sound like? We're going to pause and reflect on what her music sounds like, and I'll show you some cool things in the score. All right, here is No Place Like London, the first scene. To me, this opening sounds very, very English. It sounds like it could have come from the hand of a Vaughan Williams or an Edward Elgar. It's a very sort of broad, again, I use the word majestic, that's conveyed to us by the brass instruments. But, these melodies are simultaneously very tuneful, but perhaps a little bit ominous as well. Now Anthony sings. Remember, he's a sailor, so he's going to sing about, well, go figure, sailing. This is such a curious thing. Notice when Anthony sings, he sings No Place Like London, B, D flat, F, and he lands on a G natural. Then Todd, who's walking right next to him, sings the same notes, but his last note on London here is a G flat. It darkens it. It takes it into a different direction. It's like almost like Todd is singing about the same place, but it means something completely different to him. This is a really small detail, and of course, it could fly right under the radar for most listeners. But if you listen to it, it's there. And these little details, I think, are something that Sondheim excels at. It really suffuses the score with a number of what a later generation might call sort of Easter eggs, right? All right, now Anthony is going to address Mr. Todd and ask him. Notice the time signature changes to 7/8, which is, of course, an unusual and unconventional asymmetrical meter. But that's par for the course. I mentioned at the top of the program, Sondheim's music is difficult. One of the things that's difficult about it is rhythm. And the rhythm here, because it's in 7, is so unconventional for someone who doesn't listen to Stravinsky or progressive rock or some genre where you'd encounter this. These are things that are very hard to commit to memory because the pattern is so erratic. Let's listen. We can see here that Sondheim is clearly depicting this beggar woman as insane, right? And how does he do that? She has this sort of soaring chromatic melody, alms, alms for a miserable woman. And even though it is chromatic, it's still very lyrical, right? This presents her to us as a woman who's down on her luck. Again, she's begging for alms. And then all of a sudden, the time signature changes, of all things, to 9/16 time. How many of you, even those of you who read music regularly, have ever seen 9/16 time? And here, of course, she's soliciting sexual services. So the music is going to change completely. And then immediately back to this chromatic lyrical music. So this is really interesting, right? I've kind of planted the seeds that maybe there's more to this beggar woman than meets the eye. And all of a sudden in this line, we're given our first clue. She sees Todd and says, "Hey, don't I know you, mister?" Well, we know that Todd is originally from London, so this could be someone from his past. But Todd's reaction, of course, is rather gruff. "Must you glare at me, woman? Off with you, off, I say." Did you notice this music is really lifted from the introductory ballad of Sweeney Todd? But of course, it's manipulated, it's changed. And again, the dissonance here cannot be overstated. Ending a sonority on this interval, for example, from the F sharp to the F, this is what music theorists would call a split octave or a diminished octave. And it's just such a weird way to spell music. It's such a weird dissonant interval to land on. Now, some of you may say, well, what is that? If you're not a music theorist, you've never studied music, what does that mean? What I would suggest is that there are parts of Sweeney Todd, as I mentioned earlier, where it's really impossible to say what key we're in or where we're headed, that the music is so dissonant, it verges on atonality. And intervals like this are a great example of that. Now Todd is going to sing about his former life. He's referring to himself, obviously. There was a barber, that's him. Okay. And now we're going to meet Mrs. Lovett. Well, we get a sense of what Sweeney Todd thinks of London, right? He describes it as a great black pit where a privileged few sit at the top, and they sort of laugh as they manipulate the this menagerie, the zoo that's at their feet. And he describes his old life in London, but obliquely, not in any direct terms. And when Anthony presses him, all he says is, "Oh, that was a long time ago." But here's what we know. Here's what we learned here. We learned that Todd was a barber and that he had a beautiful wife whom he loved dearly. And that there was a man with power, turns out he was a judge, we'll meet him later, who would Judge Turpin, a name synonymous with malfeasance and criminal avarice. He coveted Todd's wife, and so he contrived to have Todd arrested and sent to a penal colony so that he could take his wife all for himself. The wife's name is Lucy, by the way. We don't know what happened after that. Todd, of course, is the narrator, and all he knows is that he went to a penal colony for 15 years. He's come back to London, and so he must be curious what became of his wife. He's going to find out here, and again, Mrs. Lovett will be the one who tells him. Now, Mrs. Lovett, we described her as sort of an older, slatternly woman, completely depraved, completely amoral, avaricious and rapacious, and comical. Comical in that she takes some of the more gruesome scenes in the musical and suffuses them with, I think, a degree of lightheartedness, which is really essential. Remember, if you're Sondheim, or even Tim Burton for that matter, making a film out of this, you don't want it to be too dark, too depressing. There has to be some reprieve. There has to be some release from all of this dark and grisly source material from the Penny Dreadfuls, and therefore Mrs. Lovett fulfills that role. I should point out here that with all of the gruesome elements we keep talking about, that apparently American audiences were much more fixated on that particular aspect of the musical than the London audiences were. When this premiered in the West End, apparently the story goes that the London audiences didn't bat an eyelash at the macabre violence and such that suffuses and pervades the plot, whereas the American audiences were, I guess we might say, a bit more squeamish. All right, let's check some comments. Yes. Barber asks about the Mi Paisan Try Little Priest. Yes, we are going to listen to that later. And yes, the orchestras of the early days of musical theater were bigger. That's true. Barbara, I think you asked earlier about a song from Merrily We Roll Along, right? Which is also by Sondheim. Jane says, sounds a little bit like the Three Penny Opera. Yeah, Kurt Weill or Kurt Weill. I think, they're Sondheim's born a little bit later than Kurt Weill, but sure, the style is not going to be altogether, alien. All right, so we meet Mrs. Lovett, and to really put over the fact that Mrs. Lovett is a sort of very base character, she's going to speak in a very distinct and sing in a very distinct accent. And of course, it's a Cockney accent. So it's going to kind of make us cognizant of the fact as the audience that this is sort of a lower class person. You might say a blue collar worker, somebody who rolls up her sleeves and sort of has dry, calloused hands from kneading dough and working with flour and that sort of thing. She's sort of down to earth, but definitely not salt of the earth. That's definitely not the case. So when we meet Mrs. Lovett, remember she's got this pie shop on Fleet Street in London. But the thing is, the pie shop is doing terribly. She laments the fact that meat is so hard to come by, it's so expensive, and when she does get it, it's of the poorest quality, and nobody wants to buy her pies because they're atrocious. So what's she supposed to do? Well, Benjamin Barker, aka Sweeney Todd, shows up, and he meets Mrs. Lovett and finds out that she's renting space above her pie shop. So she shows him around and says, this area used to belong to a barber a long time ago. But he got carted off and sent to a penal colony in Australia. And of course, at this moment, Benjamin Barker, that is to say, Sweeney Todd, reveals his identity. She says, "I knew it was you. This is great. You can rent up here." And this thus begins their relationship. What we later learn is that Mrs. Lovett has a crush on Sweeney Todd, but it's not a traditional light-hearted, charming crush. It's a sick, twisted, demented crush, because Mrs. Lovett is a demented character. But then again, so is Sweeney Todd. He's also completely demented and warped. So maybe perhaps these two are a good match for each other. So here we have the worst pies in London. We're going to listen to this because the last song we'll listen tonight is God That's Good, which is the beginning of Act 2. And there are some similarities, but of course, very pronounced differences. But thematically, this song is the preamble to, or you might say the prelude to Act 2. Let's listen. Poor Mrs. Lovett. Well, she's not a very effective PR person for her own pie shop. She describes the the pies as revolting, which can you imagine going into a restaurant or bakery and someone said, "Try this, it's revolting." So you see where the comic relief comes in there. Did you notice how rhythmically tricky Mrs. Lovett's music is? Did you notice how the accents were all over the place? Did you notice that the time signature was constantly changing? Remember, all a time signature is a pattern of strong and weak beats. And in this case, it's impossible to entertain or anticipate when those beats are going to fall without a score. How would you know? If you didn't know the music intimately, or if you didn't have a score, it would be impossible to anticipate where those emphases are going to fall. And this is something that I think for many listeners, we get bound up devoting our attention to the text. We don't really think about the rhythm, but the rhythm here is really, I would say it's one of the real bugbears in the score. As someone who directs musical theater all the time, every semester, this piece is it's one of my favorite musicals, but I don't know that it's a piece that I would want to do at the college, just because putting it together in 10 weeks on the community theater level would be perhaps a Sisyphean task. I don't know that it would be possible, even with my students who are enormously talented. This is something that requires a real mastery of rhythm and of time signature and meter, and that's to say nothing about the harmony, which we've spoken of a few times at this point. All right, so let me sum up what happens next, and we'll jump to our next scene, which is going to be the end of Act 1, which is on page 184 in my score. So Todd finds out what happens to his wife, what happened to her, as it turns out. Mrs. Lovett tells him, well, after you were sent away, that, licentious, prurient, and lubricious Judge Turpin, who coveted your wife, he sort of took her home and he had his way with her. And he took in your daughter because Todd had a very young daughter, Johanna, um, when he was carted off, and therefore his daughter doesn't recognize him. She would be, a late teenager now, and he wouldn't recognize her. But she's all grown up, and it turns out that she was taken in as a ward of this corrupt judge. So Judge Turpin is the bad guy of this story. And that's saying something, right? Because we know that Sweeney Todd's not a good guy. If anything, he's out for vigilante justice. But as we saw in his opening number when he sings about London, he hates London. He thinks London, as he describes it later, would be a better place if the population were diminished, if it were decreased. So Todd is certainly not a heroic figure. Mrs. Lovett is definitely not a heroic figure. And yet Judge Turpin makes both of them look like saints, because Turpin is just evil to an extreme degree. Again, before the events of the musical take place, he contrives to have Sweeney Todd sent away so that he can sort of kidnap and rape his wife and take in his daughter as a ward. So what happened to his wife? What happened to Lucy? Well, as Mrs. Lovett conveys the story, poor Lucy was driven to madness here because she tries to poison herself with arsenic, and that's what happens. She poisons herself. And Mrs. Lovett basically says, she leaves it slightly vague, slightly nebulous, but implies that she poisoned herself to death. And Johanna, Todd and Lucy's daughter, is now grown up. She's, a late teenager, and she's still living as a ward of the judge. By the way, when we meet Judge Turpin later in Act 1, he is flagellating himself. As to say, he's whipping himself because he feels guilty about the lust he feels for Johanna, who's essentially his sort of, I guess you'd say his foster daughter or something like that. And then he stops whipping himself abruptly and smiles and says, "I know what to do. I'll just marry her." So he's a really sick, perverse character. In a world filled with sick and perverse characters, Judge Turpin is the worst. And he's aided in his exploits by Beadle Bamford. Now, Beadle is not a name. It's a title. A beadle is a sort of beadle with a D, is a kind of, I guess you'd say, a parish officer of sorts, somebody who enforces the law on the parish level specifically. But in this case, he is sort of the henchman of Judge Turpin. So what happens in Act 1? Well, now the plot's in motion, right? Todd has returned to London. He set up shop above the pie shop of Mrs. Lovett. They're working together, or they're living together in this very strange arrangement. Well, in Act 1, Todd exposes a charlatan, a fake by the name of Adolfo Pirelli. And this guy is going around London and Fleet Street and trying to sell an elixir that's going to regrow lost hair. And so Todd challenges him to a shaving duel. And because Todd has, spent his career, his life as a barber prior to his incarceration, he easily defeats him. In doing so, he puts himself on the radar of Judge Turpin and Beadle Bamford, who are so impressed by him that they, openly talk about making an appointment to go see him for a shave. Well, we know what happens to people who go and see Sweeney Todd for a shave. So this seems like a really good resolution to that string of the plot. But Todd is approached by Pirelli at the end of Act 1. And it turns out this guy's name is not Pirelli at all. His name is O'Higgins. And he's a charlatan. He says, "I know who you are. You're that guy that used to live here and they sent you off. If you don't pay me half of your earnings, I'm going to tell everybody in London that you're really Benjamin Barker." And of course, that would ruin all of Todd's plan. Remember, his whole plan is to somehow contrive to bring Judge Turpin into his barbershop so that he can cut his throat. And so Todd is being blackmailed and extorted here. So what does he do? He slices this charlatan's throat, and this is the first victim, who is sent down into the basement of Mrs. Lovett's pie shop. And they're wondering, what on earth do we do with the body? What do we do? We've got a murder on our hands. How do we get ourselves out of here? How do we extricate ourselves from this position? There's a little bit of dialogue here, so we'll take a look at that first, and then we'll get to it. This is the very end of Act 1. The song is called "A Little Priest." It's a duet between Mrs. Lovett and Todd. We won't listen to the whole thing. We want to get to Act 2, and then we'll wrap up. So we have 2 more numbers to listen to, the end of Act 1, the beginning of Act 2, and then we'll have a discussion. So Todd has just murdered Pirelli, aka O'Higgins. He drops into the barber chair, panting and sweating. Mrs. Lovett. She points to the chest. They put him in this chest. What do we do with this guy? What do we do with this corpse? What are we going to do? There's a lad downstairs. We better go have a look. The lad is Tobias. He sort of was working with Pirelli, and he's wondering where Pirelli's gone. Let's go ahead and listen to this. And again, think about specifically the lyrics here when Todd and Lovett are singing. They're incredibly clever. I don't know that Sondheim gets enough credit as a lyricist. I think people who know his work certainly appreciate that aspect of him, but I think if there's one thing to take away from tonight's program, it's Stephen Sondheim's facility, not just with music, as we've seen, but also with very clever poetry, very clever prose and text, and how that text is married to the musical tones. Here is the end of Act 1. The song is called Little Priest. If you're wondering, is this referring to a diminutive priest, a priest of diminutive stature? No, this would be a little as in, can I have a little cake? You hear that Mrs. Lovett's note here is completely dissonant against the chord. It's not what we want it to be. I mean, I just want to replay this so you can hear how they arrive on this dissonant sonority at the end there. To some of you, it might almost seem like the character of Mrs. Lovett is being presented as deliberately almost tone deaf. There's something very curious about that. Okay, let's talk about what happens in Act 2. So we know that Todd is looking for vengeance, right? He's trying to right the wrongs of the past by really committing this vigilante killing of Judge Turpin and Beadle Bamford if he gets in the way, but it's the judge he's really after. But his secondary goal here is he thinks his wife poisoned herself and expired in that fashion, but he knows that his daughter is somewhere in London, or at least he thinks she is. And so these are some of the loose ends that we have to tie up in Act 2. Act 1 concludes with Todd and Lovett conspiring to, in a joking way and with this music that, what dance form does it evoke for you when you listen to what we just listened to? I think for many it's a waltz, right? So we can almost imagine the champagne splash ballrooms of Vienna with all of the elegance of that period of, say, Johann Strauss Jr. We get this waltz, and yet the text is completely depraved and demented and psychotic. So, there's an opposition here, which is presented deliberately, and I think is very dramatically effective at conveying to us, the audience, that these characters are deeply psychologically scarred and abnormal. Well, what happens when they start to incorporate this new mystery ingredient into the pies? Of course, business is booming, and that's how Act 2 begins, with a number that in many ways touches on some of the music that we've heard in Act 1. That is to say, remember Mrs. Lovett sings "The Worst Pies in London." We listen to it. All of a sudden, she's got not the worst pies in London, but what most people, the Londoners, think are no doubt the best pies in London. Delectable, irresistible. And who is supplying this? Well, Todd is on this vigilante mission to, as he suggests earlier in the musical, to decrease the population of London by essentially murdering people who come into his barbershop. Now, in order to facilitate this operation, Todd orders a very special chair. And the chair, there's a lot that's made about the chair. It's a special chair that sits on the upper floor of Mrs. Lovett's pie shop, but it has a secret lever that when he pulls it, it sort of drops the body backwards into a chute that goes all the way into the basement where the pies are prepared. So this is some, as we keep saying, this is some really dark imagery, but no detail is left unmentioned here. We know exactly how the bodies are, how the targets or the marks are dispatched. And now early in Act 2, Todd is sort of nervously awaiting the arrival of his chair. He sort of wants his chair very badly so that he can get his operation going in earnest. So let's listen to the opening number of Act 2. It's called God, That's Good. And you can almost imagine the customers smacking their lips here as they dine on these delectable pies, having absolutely no inkling, not a scintilla of a clue as to where the meat from these pies must have come from. All we know is we've heard about a rival pie shop run by Mrs. Mooney, and mysteriously all of the cats in the neighborhood in Mrs. Mooney's pie area are disappearing. But as we learn in Act 2, Mrs. Mooney is basically out of business because Mrs. Lovett's pie shop is the talk of the town, the toast of the town. These are irresistible pies. And what I love about this one is, again, Sondheim's lyrics and his sense of rhythm. Notice how difficult the ensemble parts are, especially, and how sort of herky-jerky and erratic the rhythm is in this opening number from Act 2. Here is God, That's Good. Again, so we have a few things happening simultaneously. Mrs. Lovett is presiding over her now very successful pie shop. Tobias, who, if you remember, Toby was the assistant to Adolfo Pirelli, who was dispatched. He was the first victim dispatched, as Mrs. Lovett inimitably says in a Cockney accent, the Italian. He actually wasn't Italian. He was a charlatan impersonating one, though. At any rate, so you've got Todd. He's waiting for his chair. Mrs. Lovett is presiding over the pie shop. And Toby is now working with Todd and Lovett because Toby works as a sort of a waiter at the pie shop. Here is the score. And again, the music here, very difficult. Maybe this is the most complex piece in the entire show. Did you notice this pattern that many of you associate sort of with the bells of London? Yum, bum, 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 associated with the clocks and bells. Here it's presented to us, but it's very dissonant and I think in some ways very off-putting because it sounds unstable. It sounds like something is not quite right. So we're clearly, the music takes us, and as the curtain comes up, we know we're right back in London, but how things are it's a sort of an indication that things have become quite demented in the plot. That's a kind of number that, as a musical director, you look at the score and think, well, I'm glad we don't have to prepare that anytime soon. That would be a bugbear to put together. We're going to get to some questions momentarily, but first I want to talk about how this story ends. As you probably know, or if you don't, you can anticipate, you can guess, there is no happy ending here. Actually, the only characters who really survive are the characters of Anthony. Remember our good sailor from the very first scene who rescued Todd and brought him back to London? Anthony is going to be smitten by a young girl who he first hears singing from her window. And it turns out that this girl is none other than Johanna, Todd's long-lost daughter. But other than that particular aspect of the ending, everything else is very dark, very sinister, very tragic. In a nutshell, Todd finally succeeds in inviting Judge Turpin in for a shave. And just as he's making small talk with the judge recognizes him and shouts, "Benjamin Barker," of course his real name, recognizing him, but Todd is successful in slashing his throat and sending him down the chute into the basement where Mrs. Lovett awaits. The problem is that just before that happens, Todd, in his frantic nervousness, hearing that the judge is outside, that beggar woman who we've seen a number of times. We saw her in the opening scene. We heard her alluded to in this last number. Remember where Mrs. Lovett says, "Throw the old woman out," talking about the beggar woman. Well, she happens to be in Todd's shop, and he panics because he sees the judges outside. He wants to get rid of her, so he cuts the old woman, that is to say, the beggar woman's throat, and throws her down the chute. So after he cuts Judge Turpin's throat, he goes down to this sort of cellar kitchen, a very sort of terrifying place the way it's described. And what happens? He sees the face of the beggar woman clearly for the first time. And who is it? It's his wife, Lucy. He's just killed his wife. And horror-stricken at this thought, he looks at Mrs. Lovett and realizes that in a way she's betrayed him, right? Because she strongly suggested that Lucy had killed herself by poisoning. And so Mrs. Lovett tries to justify it and says, well, when she poisoned herself, she might as well have killed herself because she became insane. She was no longer the person she was. That person died. So I wasn't really lying to you, love. And so then she confesses her love for Sweeney Todd, and Sweeney puts on a suave facade and dances with her one last time before pushing her alive into the oven to be immolated. Gruesome stuff. And as Todd then is kneeling over his wife's corpse, Tobias, who we sort of skated over what happens to him, but he's gone insane from all of the gruesome dealings of these two lunatics he's been working and living with. And so he sort of comes crawling out of the sewer into the cellar, and he's sort of babbling nursery rhymes and nonsense because he's gone insane. And he picks up Todd's razor and cuts Todd's throat, and that's the end of the musical. So it's not exactly a happy ending. In fact, it's anything but a happy ending. All right, let's look at some of the questions here. Barber says the meat pie song, yeah. So the meat pie lyrics are just terrific. Phantom has a big orchestra as well. Barbara asks about the orchestra in Phantom of the Opera. Well, of course, it's called Phantom of the Opera, and obviously that's a work that also straddles the line between opera and musical theater. The character of Christine in Phantom sings some of the highest notes, I think, in any musical. She goes up to an E in the 6th octave, I know, in the title number. So clearly that's more an operatic thing than it would be a musical theater thing. For those who are wondering, by the way, Phantom of the Opera, and it's not my favorite musical. Maybe there are some fans of Phantom here in the audience tonight. I think Phantom is a work that, well, Andrew Lloyd Webber in general has a very, very successful formula when he's composing. Some of his works, like Cats, for example, I don't think is a great work by any stretch. And certainly when they made it into a movie last year, it was a box office bomb and a disaster. Which perhaps testifies to the fact that maybe it's not such a great book, it's not such a great score, but he just has a knack for writing infectious material that has this broad appeal. So if you ask me what's my favorite Andrew Lloyd Webber show, the answer is Jesus Christ Superstar, followed by Starlight Express. Carol asks a really good question. Carol asks, is Sweeney Todd too complex for regional or stock theater? I think it probably is, Carol. Yeah, it probably is. Given the limitations in terms of budget, first of all, right? You imagine trying to, if you had to hire 25 musicians instead of 10, that's a huge difference, obviously. The other thing about Sweeney Todd is, as we've seen, did you notice that when the ensemble in that last number is singing More Hot Pies, that it's very difficult to anticipate what's coming next because it's so erratic, the rhythm that is. And if you look at the harmony is incredibly, incredibly dissonant at times, to the point where it's impossible to say what key it's in, and therefore we might even say it's atonal. So Carol, my answer is, I think Sweeney Todd probably is too difficult to do at the regional or certainly at the community level. This is something that you've got to have not just a great cast, not just strong leads. You've got to have a big orchestra to pull it off, and you've also got to have, I think adequate time to prepare it. There's just so many things, and the timing is really the issue, I think, that would keep this from being possible, doable on the community level. Sharon says, thank you for illuminating the rhythm, time signatures, and perverse but engaging storyline. Yes, a little priest, is upbeat. It's in the style of a Viennese waltz. It's unbelievable. It's such a clever stroke on the composer's part to put this this demented sociopathic song into this champagne splashed musical presentation. It's brilliant. Anonymous attendee. Good, great. Yes, looking at the score as opposed to looking at the lyrics. Yes, looking at the score is trickier, no doubt about it. But you know, for me, I feel, not just for musicians, I think it's great to feel immersed in the language that a composer conceives a show in, and also the language that the musicians themselves, whether they're in the orchestra or in the cast, are learning it from. In other words, when we look at the score as we do during our programs here, we get a kind of a bird's eye view of exactly the sort of anatomical construction of these works, how it's presented to the musicians and the whether it's the musical director, the cast members, the ensembles, the leads, the violinists, the oboists, whoever it is. We get a little bit closer to that style. And even if we don't read music, that's fine. We're sort of just following the lyrics anyway. So, but thank you. I'm good lecture. As always, I'm a Harel fan. I love that. Thank you so much for that. And Amanda, thank you to the Darien Library for hosting tonight's program. If I could just
of course,
sell a couple of quick plugs to you. Amanda mentioned I will be back, and we're going to continue to plumb the depths of musical theater and Broadway repertoire in the coming weeks and really in the coming months, because we have one program, I think, coming. The next one's in mid-May.
Tuesday, May 11th, from Page to Stage, Carrie the Musical.
Carrie the Musical. So how many of us are familiar with the story of Carrie, the Stephen King novella? Well, it's another dark story, obviously, one that ends in a telekinetic bloodbath. And that might make you think that that doesn't adapt well to the stage, but I think it works remarkably well. I think Carrie is a really underrated musical. I think it's probably a musical that most of our listeners, Amanda, probably don't know at all. And I'm so excited to share it with them. And that's going to be on May 11th. So very, very cool stuff. And if I can plug one more thing,
of course,
put something right now in the chat for everyone to take a look at. And this is a link to a video of my students performing an excerpt, the opening number of Pippin, the musical, which we are going to be presenting. We are one of the only, we are one of the only schools in the entire state right now putting on full-fledged musical theater, staged and choreographed. We're doing it with masks and distance, and there are many challenges there, but nonetheless, we will be presenting this April 29th and 30th on Showtix for You. It's, I can put the lyrics, the link in chat right now. But we are presenting it, and if our great community members would love to check out what's going on and watch some live theater, you can do it just by going to this link here, which I will put in chat. It's showtixforyou.com/NBCC. And that will be available on April 29th. April 29th. So April 29th and 30th, and it will be streaming also during the weekends. There are a number of time slots. You know, it's really a privilege for us to be presenting to any audience, but there are some advantages in the modality of presenting online, that we get to reach a wider audience. So I'm really excited about that. And I'm excited to come back to the Darien Library in a couple of weeks and to present a program on Carrie with music by Michael Gore, and of course the original source material from Stephen King. I think it's a tremendously compelling and worthy musical setting of this iconic story, which deals with so many themes that come up in literature and in poetry and in the movies. You know, themes of teen angst and of you know, bullying and fulfillment and the relationship between parents and children. There's a lot that's worth investigating in that score, and I'm excited to share it with our community in a couple of weeks.
We look forward to it. Thank you so much, as always.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Take care, folks.